Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Michael Denisha. I'm Associate Director of the New York University John Bradamus Center for the Study of Congress. On behalf of my colleagues, and especially our President, John Sexton, I welcome you all to the NYU Washington, D.C. Center. Opened just over a year ago, this beautiful building in our nation's capital houses one of the university's newest academic centers, bringing together top scholars and students as part of a global knowledge community. As Dr. Sexton wrote in his letter to you all, NYU always has encouraged its students, staff, and faculty to think of themselves as participants in and shapers of a complex and changing environment. Indeed, part of NYU's mission consists in preparing students for lives in a diverse world, and we believe that such preparation is most effective when the outside world is not held at bay. It is in this tradition that we host you. This event is key to understanding the differences in educational systems around the world, and I hope this conference will prove fruitful to the community of educators. Allow me to recognize James Harvey, the indefatigable director of the Superintendent's Roundtable. As many of you know, Jim is a veteran of Capitol Hill, having served on the staff of the House of Representatives. And Jim can tell you better than I that there was a time when compromise was not a dirty word on the Hill. When Democrats in Congress could pass bills creating such programs as special education and Title IX, bills that would be signed into law by Republican presidents. The political philosophies of the parties may have been far apart, but Republicans and Democrats all believed at that time that first and foremost they were elected to govern. How sobering that today we meet a few blocks from that same Capitol building, where a staunch minority who now walk those halls do not believe they are there to legislate, as evidenced by the paltry number of bills that have passed during this and the preceding Congress. Instead, they come to Washington to promote an anti-government ideology at the cost of the weakest in society who rely on programs which are now shut down. To our guests from overseas, all I can say is this is not America. Our country is not a group of rogue representatives who scoff at the idea that government can do good. It is the people, the men and women gathered here, who dedicate themselves to improving the lives of millions of children every day, educating not just future workers, but citizens, and building a better society in the process. And we all hope that the representatives in the People's House begin soon to reflect this reality. Congress may not be getting anything done today, but we are. Jim has put together the finest program of speakers, and I am sure all of you are as eager as I am to hear from this distinguished international group of scholars and educational leaders. We at the Bradamus Center are very pleased to be co-sponsoring today's event, especially as it goes to the heart of the legacy of our founder, John Bradamus, who dedicated himself to the advancement of elementary and secondary education while he served in Congress. I would like to thank especially Tom McIntyre of the Bradamus Center and Shruti Ramadugu of NYU Washington, who helped put all of this together today. And thanks to all of you for joining us. As they say in the House, I yield back the balance of my time. Jim?
As all of you know, I am a completely nonpartisan person, so I won't comment on the issues that Michael just said. I want to express again my deep gratitude to NYU and to the John Bradamus Center for making it possible for us to meet in this wonderful center. And we have a small gift for Michael here to thank him for all he has done to make this possible. So thank you. Thank you. One of the things that I noticed when we planned to go to Europe last year was that people could sort of understand why we were going to Paris to visit OECD, and they could understand why we were going to Finland to look into the Finnish educational miracle, but they really didn't understand why we would want to look at schools in France or schools in England, since obviously the focus in the United States should be on Asia, which was the looming economic threat to the United States. And I think even in economic terms, it's worth sort of paying attention to what's going on in Europe. Don't hold me exactly to these numbers, but the last time I looked at the US GDP, we have a $14 trillion economy. If you look at the combined economies of the European Union, they're about 16 trillion. So it is the largest self-contained economic unit in the world. And even in economic terms, it's well worth paying attention to what's going on in Europe. There's another reason, too, that I thought it was important we go to visit these schools. Europe is sort of the root of the American ideal of democracy. And it's not just Greece. I mean, going back to the 13th century in England, Europeans sort of set the standard for putting limits on executive privilege when they forced King John to sign the Magna Carta. The notion of an independent judiciary, of free speech, of free conscience, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, of a free press, these are all profound values that we take from Europe, and you don't see them in many other parts of the world, no matter how economically powerful they are, whether they're in the Middle East or Asia. So Europe really is the root, I think, of the values that make America great, and I think it's important that we have these transatlantic conversations for that reason, if for no other. And I think it's particularly fitting, therefore, that we actually have two historians of New York meeting with us today. One is Francois Weil, the rector of the Sorbonne and the chancellor of the universities of Paris. I'm going to give you some information on Dr. Weil in a moment. And this afternoon, we're going to be hearing from Diane Ravitch, who wrote her doctoral dissertation on the Great School Wars in New York. And speaking of roots, our first speaker gets us right back to the issue of roots in the United States. Francois Weil, and this is on page 32 of your briefing book, is an historian specializing in the social and cultural history of the United States, and he's director of studies professor at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. He served as president of EHESS from 2009 to 2012, and the president of France, François Hollande, appointed him in July 2012 as rector of the Académie of Paris and chancellor of the universities of Paris. And France is divided into 30 academies. I think of them as sort of similar to our states for the administration of French primary and secondary education. And in his capacity as rector of the Academy of Paris, Dr. Weil is in charge of all public education in Paris, ranging from kindergarten to the university. So this is a very powerful French academic that we have with us today. His most recent book, Family Trees, A History of Genealogy in America, was published in May of this year. It's described as a seminal work, that a must-have book for any genealogist, and it examines the meaning of the quest for roots in American history and culture, including recent developments in genetics and DNA testing. So when I say that the roots of American values rest in Europe, we have someone who truly understands that here as our first speaker this morning. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Weil.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor and it's a distinctive privilege for me to address the National Superintendent's Roundtable. And I thank you for your invitation to join in your conversation this morning. I'm grateful to Mr. Harvey for giving me the opportunity to share with you some thoughts on education in France. And I'm also grateful to the French Embassy to the United States for making this visit possible. There are many things I want to tell you, but I should probably start by explaining, although Mr. Harvey just did it, but by explaining, as we say in the lingo of the social sciences, where I speak from. I'm, as it was said, the rector of the Academy of Paris, the chancellor of the Universities of Paris, one of the territorial units headed by a rector in charge of public education as a whole, from kindergarten to university in his or her academy. It's a centralized system that goes back to Napoleon. By tradition and by protocol, the rector of Paris is the highest ranking civil servant in the French ministries of education and higher education. And like my fellow rectors in Lyon, in Bordeaux, in Toulouse, I was appointed by the President of the Republic. The President of the Republic can also release me from my duties whenever he chooses. In other words, as you say, I think in English, we serve at the pleasure of the President. My office is indeed in the Sorbonne, and my responsibility is primary, secondary, and higher education in Paris. In rough numbers, this means I oversee education for about 300,000 primary and high school children, another 300 to 400,000 university students, and roughly 40,000 school teachers, university faculty, administrators, and support staff. I should add that the universities are autonomous and that my role as Chancellor of the Universities of Paris is not the same, is not as directive as it is vis-à-vis the primary and secondary education. Number-wise, Paris is not the largest academy in France, nor is it the most troubled one. The two neighboring academies near Paris, Versailles, west, and Créteil, east of Paris, are in the former case the largest, and in the latter case, the toughest of all French academy. But Paris has its own specific challenges. And for instance, more than anywhere else in France, the proximity with the seats of national power, and they are working these days, and the unparalleled concentration of political and media players add a political dimension to educational issues and a political sensitivity to educational issues. This morning, I'd like to briefly discuss with you some of the educational challenges we face in France today, and also the choices that are being made to meet these challenges. So let me start with the challenge, what I call the challenge of French education, the state of our educational system and the challenges ahead of us. As you know, education in France is a public service since the 19th century. Educational issues are intimately connected to the history of republicanism in France from the 1870s onwards. At the time, Republican political leaders, thinkers, and educators defined primary education as free, secular, and compulsory for all children. And throughout the 20th century, this vision of a Republican education, of a teaching republic, as to borrow a term of the time, not only survived, but even grew to include secondary education as of the 1950s and 1960s. The democratization of secondary education was long a bourgeois preserve, so the democratization of secondary education was a slow process in France, but by the late 1960s and 1970s, secondary and higher education had become accessible to a much larger proportion of young French women and men than ever before. Education is also a centralized public service. And behind centralization, I understand this is in contrast with the situation you experience here in the US. Behind centralization lay both a political and administrative tradition deep-seated in French history, and the content of the cultural connection established between education and nation building in France. It goes back to decisions made in the late 18th and early 19th century. In 1793, French revolutionaries decided to suppress the universities, which they saw as embodiments of the old regime. By 1808, Napoleon recreated a centralized university system, which was also in charge of secondary education throughout the country, and which was locally managed by rector chancellors. Although the system has experienced considerable transformation over the last 2 centuries, this tradition of centralization remains vigorous to this day. Public, democratized, centralized. As a consequence, the state plays a decisive role in education in France. 85% of all children attend public schools, and most of the others attend private schools which have signed a contract with the state and which receive full funding for their teaching staff in exchange for implementing national curricula and respecting educational principles defined by the state. The budget of the French Ministry of Education is, not surprisingly, by far the first budget of the state with over 64 billion euros. The budget of the Ministry of Higher Education, which oversees public universities, i.e. almost all universities in France, reaches 26 billion euros. In Paris, the budget for primary and secondary education I'm responsible for is about 1.5 billion euros. I believe, which is about $2 billion. I believe many of you know the organization of our system. Almost all 3 to 6-year-old attend kindergarten. Then children go to elementary schools, and then what you call junior high, and which we deceptively name collège. It's not a college, it's a collège. It's a junior high. School attendance is compulsory until 16. After collège, children then go to high school and prepare for the baccalaureate, which opens the gate to higher education. It's the first degree of higher education in our system. The French educational system, as I've briefly described it, faces today a series of major challenges which have led the current French President, François Hollande, to define it as a national priority and ask the Prime Minister, Jean-Marc Ayrault, and the Minister of Education, Vincent Payon, to recreate, to found a new French education, to reinvent French education. Among these major challenges are first, the increased disparity in school performance by French children, a disparity which in part reflects the depth of social, economic, and cultural inequality in France. Second challenge, the need to adapt our pedagogy to the new needs of the 21st century. Third, the necessity of transforming the training of our future teachers for helping them, in order to help them operate happily and efficiently in the classroom of the 21st century. And always remember that all this has to be done in the context of a public, democratic, and centralized system. At the time of François Hollande's election as President of France in May 2012, the need for a major policy initiative in education had become acute. Over the previous 10 years, education had been, let's say, slightly forgotten. Major cuts had impacted the education budget, suppressing about 80,000 teaching positions, as well as training programs for future teachers. In 2008, the length of the school week in kindergartens and elementary schools was reduced from 4.5 days to 4 days a week, and as a result, France had the dubious privilege to have its school year reduced to 144 days, as against an average of 186 for OECD countries. While it was argued at the time that the reduction in the number of teachers would make it possible to pay those who remained better, in fact, in a very French way, only the first part of the proposition was implemented, fewer teachers, that is, thus creating major tensions in the system, as well as tense discussions with teachers' unions. Moreover, the general context of disinvestment and budgetary reduction prevented any significant advance in discussions about pedagogical issues and stakes for many players in the educational sphere simply refuse to sit at the table. In the meantime, children's school performance, as measured by PISA tests, continued to diminish on average. Numbers suggested that the system continued to be efficient and helpful for the best school children, but that the growing number of French children were left behind, a fact of dramatic consequence for them, first of all, but also for the future of the social fabric and of the economy of France. These were briefly summarized, and I think fairly summarized, the challenges the current government faced when it came to power a year and a half ago. Let me now move to the answers which were and are being given. The Education Minister, Vincent Payon, calls it reinventing a French education, refonder l'éducation. So this reinvention of French education, what is it? It is the current French government's policy, and it is a major initiative to break up with the choices made over the last 10 years. It's embodied in a law which was approved by the National Assembly and the Senate last July. It defines the principles which will organize public education, and it allocates means over the next few years for educational matters, significant amount of money. At the core of this reinvention of French education lay an impressive budgetary effort, or all the more impressive in the very difficult economic situation of France. And behind this effort is the firm belief that an investment in education is the best possible investment for the future. Education being socially, politically, economically, and culturally far less costly, as we know, than ignorance. This significant financial effort allows for a series of programs with three main objectives in mind. So first, we aim at reducing educational inequalities. This is a major issue today, as I have suggested, which results in a growing gap between those who succeed and those who fail. In fact, failure in school generally amounts to exclusion from most opportunities available in our knowledge society. And therefore, the reinvention of French education is first and foremost a reinvention of the promise of Republican education. Our minister decided to focus on kindergarten and elementary education first, something that had probably not been done on this scale since the times of Jules Ferry and the founders of Republican education in the late 19th century. Most reforms since then have focused on junior high and high school rather than kindergarten and elementary schools. Over the last 18 months, several thousand teaching positions were created, and rectors were urged to allocate these new resources to fight educational inequalities. Two programs in particular are initiated in this very academic year. One aims at providing access to kindergarten to 2-year-olds coming from families who are culturally and socially estranged from school culture. Usually it's 3-year-old. We are aiming at getting some kids in at 2-year-old. New teachers have been assigned to schools which cater to such children, and we are working, and it is really a work of persuasion, we are working to convince their parents that these children would benefit from an early kindergarten education. It's sometimes not easy, but we think it's worth the effort. We will, of course, monitor and evaluate the interest and efficiency of this program, both at the level of each academy and at the national level. In Paris, we're experiencing this program with 8 classrooms this year. So it's really an experimental thing. On the national level, it's of course much more. Second, we're starting another program this fall called More Teachers Than Classrooms. It may not seem revolutionary to you, or at least to some of you, but in the French system, it is. And it is because of the affective, often intimate relationship which exists between kindergarten and elementary school teachers on one hand and their classrooms as space on the other hand. So in schools selected because they receive children from families which concentrate a disproportionate share of social and economic distress, 2 teachers will work in one classroom, making it possible to provide better attention to those children who need it most. Each academy also develops its own strategy for reducing inequality based on the local context and local resources, and rectors are encouraged to develop their own strategy in the local context. I stress this because I would not want you to equate centralization with uniformity. A rural academy and an urban one like Paris have very different strategies. In terms of performance, if I may say a few words about Paris, in terms of performance, Paris is in the national average. A result that suggests how strong educational contrasts can be in France's capital, indeed as strong as economic and social contrasts. I too could tell a tale of 2 cities. Educational success is heavily concentrated in the central, southern, and western districts of Paris, whereas in the northeastern part of Paris, we have what I would call a definite margin for improvement. And this is where we concentrate the new means we received. This is also where we try to build on the extraordinary cultural resources offered by Paris in the hope to broaden the children's horizons and stimulate their ambitions. I'm a strong believer in partnership between schools and cultural institutions, and in Paris we have no excuse for not being at the vanguard. Such programs have been created between our schools, particularly those in the northeast of Paris, and cultural institutions like the Paris Opera, major theater, concert halls, and museums. These partnerships involve real collaboration, not simply visits or presentations. In the case of the opera, for instance, children will work with opera artistic and technical personnel to produce a musical and theatrical show, which they perform at the end of the year in the Paris Opera itself, which makes them discover the riches of the place over a very extended period of time. Sometimes these programs can be developed over several years, like these elementary school children with no musical background at all, and from a very disadvantaged families who learn the violin as a group for 4 years at the opera. Their results at school were much better than those of children of similar background who did not benefit from the program, and actually after 4 years, several of them entered the conservatory, music conservatory. In Paris, my goal is to offer all underprivileged children the opportunity of broadening their horizon through these cultural partnerships, which are systematically developed and regularly assessed. Our second goal is to transform French schools in a pedagogical sense and adapt them to the needs and context of the 21st century. We are lucky to have a Minister of Education, Vincent Payon, who has been interested in educational issues for many years before he was put in charge of education by President Hollande. With a PhD in philosophy and several books on republicanism and Republican educators in the late 19th century, he has first-hand knowledge of the traditional Republican conception of school pedagogy. And with his close advisors, who are also keen connoisseurs of the history of education in France, he's all the more sensitive to the necessity of transforming pedagogy in French schools, as well as to the need of adapting them to the new context created by technological change. Traditionally, pedagogy in France has emphasized the vertical communication of knowledge by knowing teachers to learning children. Over the last 130 years, the system has proven its overall efficiency, but it has also shown clear limits. what happens if the children cannot learn or do not want to learn? The traditional answer emphasizes discipline and the stern display of authority, with results varying depending on time and place, both in terms of acceptance of authority and of efficiency of the learning process. Overall, French traditional pedagogy supposes a societal consensus over the nature of authority, which has largely disappeared. Moreover, it may simply not be the best way to stimulate children's ability and desire to learn. In this respect, we in France are learning from methods implemented in other European countries, such as Finland, as well as in the United States. We can also build on the experience accumulated in France in those few experimental schools, junior high schools and high schools, which our centralized system has always been wise enough to let coexist on the side. There are some in Paris, as there are some in all academies. Basically, we want our schools to be more benevolent than they were and that they are. This means we are working at developing and changing pedagogical practices and programs by implementing new programs which insist on personalization, on individualization of teaching strategies. And here, clearly, we encounter other pedagogical traditions, including some which have been prevalent, if not dominant, in the US lately. We do not want to abandon or even to decrease the traditional French emphasis on authority in the learning process, but we hope to redefine it. We hope to ground it in a more individualized approach of the child. We believe this is a necessary adaptation of our school system, one which will make it more attuned to the cultural and social reality of our country in this early 21st century. And I must tell you, it's not an easy transformation of our system in its centralized dimension, but we really think we have to do it. A connected transformation of our pedagogy is our digital ambition for our schools. Although much has been done in France, in fact, over the last 10 years, I would describe the current state of our digital education as unequal and dispersed. We still lack a coordinated program, a shared goal, a strategy in digital matters. We are convinced that e-education can be a valuable tool for our schools, and that digital resources can help bring about educational success, especially for the most disadvantaged kids. And this is why the ministry has been launching a few months ago a major initiative at the national level, a strategical, political, digital ambition for the country, with the various academies being in charge of developing their own projects and programs in this coordinated effort. Our third goal is to train teachers adequately. Now, this may seem obvious, but it is in fact an issue we had to address in France. As I mentioned, training programs for future teachers were removed or at least limited over the previous period, and something had to be done. Our answer has been to recreate training schools, what we call the Superior Schools for Teaching and Education, ESPE in French. There is one per academy. They associate local universities and the academy's education professionals. Students there receive both disciplinary training in the partner universities and professional training in the ESPE. A similar system had existed before, but it was based on the sequential logic. First, you went to the university and you received training in a given field, mathematics, English, history, etc. Then you took a competitive exam in that field, and if you were successful, you were turned into a civil servant, to a teacher. And finally, and only then, you received professional training on how to teach. Much of this was not satisfactory, and anyway, it was suppressed over the last few years, leaving in the last few years rookie teachers without professional training before they hit the classrooms. In the new model we are trying to implement, disciplinary and professional trainings are not sequential, but simultaneous. It's not easy to implement, I must say, because it means that the universities have to become real, fully involved partners, since the future teachers share their time between disciplinary training in the university and professional training in the ESPE. In Paris, where I have the largest number of universities and of students in France, I have about 300 to 400 university students, lots of universities. We have made some progress over the last 6 months, but I acknowledge that we still have a significant margin of progression in order to reach a satisfactory partnership. And this requires much discussion over the respective merits of disciplinary and professional training, discussions which are ongoing. So this is really a period of great change. I think we are in the right direction. I think we will better train the teacher our primary and secondary education system needs. But clearly, you have to understand that this is a huge effort. It is a major dimension of the government's educational ambition. If we fail in training these new teachers, the whole project will be a failure. So we cannot afford to fail in the training of our teacher. Finally, it was suggested I should say a few words, and I will be very brief, I promise, over the state of higher education in France. Since I want to leave time for discussion in case you have questions, I just want to limit myself to a couple of remarks on education, which will help you understand the continuity between primary, secondary education and higher education. I would say that the French educational system is the result of a double process, what I call the layer cake and the silo. Layer cake, French system of higher education developed since the 16th century as a layer cake. We call it in French a millefeuille, delicious cake, but complicated. A layer cake since the 16th century with new institutions being added whenever a new need arose to existing ones, whenever a need arose, being added to existing ones which of course were allowed to continue to exist. The university existed since the Middle Ages. In the 16th century, university could not deal with the stakes of humanism, so we created the Collège de France. In the 18th century, the scientific and engineering challenges could not be met by the universities, so we created engineering schools and l'École Normale Supérieure to train the scientific teachers. In the 19th century, we created other schools. In 20th century, a research university could not be up to the challenge of modern science, so we created full-time research organizations. That's what I call the layer cake. And the French higher education is here to this. And second, that means that higher education, let me add a few words about this layer cake. This means that higher education is actually bifurcated in France between universities, schools, which we call grandes écoles, higher schools if you want, some of which are private and others are public, and research organization, a little like your National Institute of Health, but which have much larger goals and components. Second, the silo effect. In the 1960s and 1970s, the democratization of French universities, which is both a cause and a consequence of May 68 in France, the democratization of French universities led to the creation of many new universities all over France, often on a strictly disciplinary basis. Science, law, medicine, humanities, etc. Before 1968, you had fewer universities. They were not catering to many students, but they were global universities, or at least they were transdisciplinary universities. There was one university in Paris. There are now 17 universities in and around Paris. So we have this silo disciplinary effect and this layer cake effect, which is the result of the history of our system. One of our paradox is that access to higher education is considered a right for any student with a baccalaureate. They have a right to enter the university. How do we deal with that? Well, we maintain this dual system of schools which are allowed and even encouraged to be selective, and of universities which are not allowed to select their students at the first year level, at a time where universities are also expected to compete with the best ones worldwide in research terms. We have this dual system. As a result, our education is complex, it's rather unreadable, it's not easy to transform. I should add, however, that it's quite productive scientifically. It's one of the best in the world, which is not a small feat given the complexity of the system I've just described. Let me just point to one direction for change, which has been pursued for the last 15 years by the various French governments, and is at the core of the action of our current Minister for Higher Education, Madame Geneviève Fioraso. The Parliament adopted over the summer a law she submitted, and which reinforces efforts to bring together the universities, the schools, and the research organizations I've just described, to bring them together in new territorial clusters, which should simplify the landscape of higher education. In large cities where 3, sometimes 4 universities, Lyon, Toulouse, Bordeaux, 3-4 universities emerged after 1968, mergers sometimes happen. There will be only one University of Lyon tomorrow, one University of Bordeaux, one University of Toulouse, instead of 3 or 4. Toulouse 1, Toulouse 2, Toulouse 3. The interest is really not only to contribute to institutional simplification, it is that, but it's not only that. It's also to help create interdisciplinary clusters. And why do we want to create interdisciplinary clusters? Because that's one of the keys of global innovation as we know it in the 21st century. So we have to bring together all these institutions which are the product of our complex history in higher education. There are risks to this process, to be sure, but if our university leaders and chancellors of the university are there to help them in this task, if university leaders understand how they can profit from both simplification and institutional pluralism within the new institution they are creating, well, then the French system will be headed in the right direction. This is what I wanted to tell you this morning about the state of and the challenge we face in education and higher education. And I'm prepared to answer questions if you have any, of course. Thank you.
So, Dr. Weil, I think you can hear me. We have microphones here. If I could ask you to comment on 2 things. At breakfast this morning, you mentioned that you were concerned that vocational education seems to be somewhat getting lost in the shuffle in France, and I responded that seems to be true here too. So that's one issue I'd like you to comment on. And the second issue is something that surprised us when we were in France last year. We learned that something like 40 or 60% of the employees of the French government are actually teachers or teaching staff or employed in the education system. And if you would say something about that, that would be helpful too.
All right. For the second question, it's related to the weight of the education budget and the budget of the state, which I mentioned. By far, education is by far the largest budget in the national budget. and most of that money goes to paying teachers. It's teachers in education, faculty in the higher education. This is by far the largest size of the budget. And I don't have the numbers in mind, but they are indeed huge. This is a primary responsibility of the state, and this is, most French people consider that this contract between France and its citizens, that the state should provide a public education to all its citizens. For the first point of vocational education, yes, that's an important thing. Traditionally in France, we have emphasized general education at the expense of vocational education. And this is different in Germany, for instance, where vocational education is more valued than it is in France. We are conscious, and the current government is conscious, of the need to transform that image and the reality. But I would say first the image, because in fact, the vocational education we have in France is excellent. We have excellent schools, junior high school and high schools. In Paris, we have wonderful places for vocational education where students learn stone cutting and repairing cathedrals, where they learn the fashion. We have several fashion high schools in Paris, which are really at the international level. But the general image of these programs is not what it should be in the French mind, if I'm allowed an anthropological generalization. And we have to change that. So, but clearly, this is typically not something that's decided by a minister or by a rector. It is a bottom-up, long-term process where you have to emphasize the value of this program, both to the children who go through them, and I tell you, whenever I go to in these schools, I'm amazed at the enthusiasm that I find with these children, and also the value to the state, to the economy at large, because through this program, we train great people who are extremely valuable to our economy in the future. So the government has decided to make vocational education, what we call lycée professionnel et lycée technologique, professional and technological schools, a priority, not only in terms of effective means, but also in terms of image that we are trying to change. We have no illusions that it will take a long time to change that idea in the minds of many people in France. But we think it's really worth starting now, because it's really an important issue.
Thank you very much. Why don't we start here with Tim?
Could you explain more and expand on your third goal, the teacher training, and how you're working with the universities? Is there going to be some formalized plan, or can every university do what they want as you look at increasing, how to teach versus
that's the difficulty. They cannot do what they want.
Yes.
They can.
As it is here too.
They are partners. Public universities are partner of this. They are in charge of providing the future teachers with their disciplinary training. But since we are now implementing this simultaneous and not sequential model, that means that this disciplinary training will take a smaller part of the school year for these teachers, who at the same time will be learning their future profession in the ESPE, in the professional school, and we'll also have on-site training in various schools in the academy. So the time of the teacher is split in three. In the past, the university controlled the first years by itself and did not have to account for those years. They were just training future historians, future chemists, future mathematicians. Now they have to design training programs in liaison with the ESPE. That's where the fact that the educational system at the local level is headed by rectors, chancellors, is very helpful, because I'm responsible for both primary, secondary education and higher education. I'm not the president of the presidents, of course, because they are autonomous, but I'm the representative of the state, and my responsibility to have a conversation with them about how they should organize the time for the future teacher. We are just starting this year, so it's a very experimental situation. In several academies, it's going well. In Paris, it's going pretty well. But we still have discussions, and it's usually not only with the university presidents, it's usually with the faculty within the universities who used to teach us so many hours of history to the future teachers that don't want to reduce it. We explain them that it's going to be a sequential training with less history the first year, but it's going to be over more years. But it's a difficult conversation we have from time to time.
So let's do Paul, and then Mike, and then Jerry.
Thank you very much for coming to Washington, D.C. and taking time out of your extremely busy schedule. We deeply appreciate that. I'm curious about your second goal, increasing personalization and maintaining discipline. Would you say more about what that means?
Well, it's something that I've seen in schools in the U.S., actually, where you are capable, where you are often able to, and I was in Chicago over the last few days in the CPS system, and I saw in illustrations of that, where the fact there was a quite assumption of discipline in the school, and at the same time a very personalized attention that was provided to the children. We think that society has changed in France. The teacher-parents relation have changed. The relationship between the school as it's in itself and the parents is changing. Even in the public system, it is changing. It's a more it's a relation where the parents now do not accept the school authority as they would have done a century ago, and therefore the school institution has to change at the same time. We have to reinvent the meaning of authority. Sometimes it is said that after 1968, authority disappeared in the French system. I don't think it has, actually. What has disappeared, what has changed, is the consensus between the various actors of the school over what authority means. And I think that the best way to recreate this consensus is to recreate it in a more individualized setting, more attuned to the need of each children, which can be different. So it is that transformation. That's a transformation which we are discussing a lot with the teachers' unions, because it means a change of a style of running the classroom, and these discussions are lively.
So in that, thank you again for coming. It's very thoughtful presentation. In that connection, I'm interested in this question of authority and the transmission of knowledge, which I think we would say in the United States has also been the way that traditionally we taught. Teacher's job is to know, the student's job is to learn. It's pretty simple. So in the last, 15, 20 years, there's been more emphasis in the States on the importance of developing critical thinking, innovative thinking, creative thinking, and so on. And so there's kind of being a transformation, I think, in a lot of practice from a system that was focused on transmitting skills and transmitting certain knowledge to a system that's trying to ask kids to think more openly and think better about what they're learning. I'm really interested because in France, it seems to me, there's never really been a shortage of critical thinking or analytical. Consider at least country that obviously has produced a lot of people who have gone, well beyond the mastery of knowledge. So I wonder if you can sort of speculate on or think about that dilemma, and how does that differentiate?
I think it's not contradictory. Most of the people you talk about actually develop their critical thinking against the system in France, one way or the other. I mean, I'm not going to give names, but they are known, and sometimes they had trouble working in the system precisely because they were developing their critical thought against the system. Derrida is a case in point, but there are many others. So I think that this transformation you mentioned for the U.S., we are beginning to experience it in France, and I think it is really connected to the need for transformation or not. If you go to some of the best high schools in Paris with students who have, let's say, whose families are have a school culture, have always had a school culture, sometimes over several generations, often culture connected to the fact that there are teachers or faculty in their family. So in those high schools, you do not need to transform the pedagogy. You still can have the knowing teacher and the learning student. And frankly, I visit some of these from time to time. It strikes me how they have not changed since I was a student there 40 years ago. I suspect that in 40 years they will still be the same, and it doesn't really matter. Because these are the schools where the best students will succeed anyway. And sometimes I suspect that there were no teachers, they would still succeed. What is really different is those other areas in Paris where we have a major social and cultural challenge, and where the techniques which work and which have historically worked in our system just don't apply. And so this is where the transformations of pedagogy need to be implemented, is actually implemented. This is really the vanguard, the forefront of pedagogical transformation, those elementary and high schools in Paris. And you see there are great things invented by the various teams. And this is the lessons we are trying to draw from these schools. It works so well in those underprivileged schools. Couldn't we extend it? Couldn't we work with it on larger? Isn't that better for the children in the long run than the traditional way? So this is what we are discussing. It stems from a need, but we want to extend it to the system in general.
Sounds very familiar somehow.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Jerry.
You mentioned two-year-old education. What research did you do before you decided, and then how did that make you decide to start two-year-old education? And what's happened since you started implementing?
Okay, I did not do any research, I reassure you, because this is really not my field. But what was done before that, there have been investigations made by the Ministry of Education over the last few years, actually. It's not a decision, it's a decision that was made by the current minister, but this is a type of programs which have been the object of discussion by various think tanks, by the ministry, various authors in France over the last few years. And its idea very clearly is that the sooner you bring children who are away from school culture into that school culture, the better you can expect results for these children in these families. We are just starting this. We just started this 4 weeks ago, so I won't give you results. It being started this academic year. I won't give you results because I don't have any. We don't have riots. So that's already a good, parents agree, which in France is a good thing. But what we can see, the difficulty for us is to approach the parents, discuss with them, convince them. And in Paris, Historically, we were not very good at that. The program existed before it was optional, a very, very small number. We have been giving more means this year to try to test it on a better, larger quantitative basis of the country. We'll see how it goes in the next 2-3 years and see if it's operational. What we know is that the kindergarten system starting at 3, which is the norm in France, is something that operates pretty well in those with those kids from socially disadvantaged backgrounds.
So let's take it. I don't want to select only men, so I'm going to start with Janet, and I can't quite see you there in the dark. Okay, good. Janet, and then Louise.
Thank you for being here. This is very interesting. In the United States, as you well know, transformation to many people includes high-stakes testing. Where does that fit at all in the transformation in France?
We have a complex relationship to testing and to evaluation in general. And clearly, all these transformations are being assessed, evaluated, assessed, and we started from the realization that the PISA system showed a decline over the last few years, and that something had to be done. So and this is a sort of consensual realization in France, and so the current government based its programs on this notion that something had to be done, that more means had to be given the system, but that the allocation of more means had to lead to a transformation of a series of areas in the educational system. So we do not, we are trying to use these all this as indicators, but again, I'm describing changes which are really starting now, and so it's difficult to assess them for the time being.
So let's do Louise, Marianne, and then Tom. We could be here all morning, obviously. I'm sorry, Teresa.
On the training of teachers, you mentioned future teachers and new teachers with the university school model, which has worked in some parts of the country here in the United States. But what about the veteran teachers? If we're doing new training with new teachers and changing the pedagogical viewpoints, what are you doing with the veteran teacher populations?
We are also working with the veteran teacher. There is an ongoing training program in each academy for the teachers, including for digital education. In the Academy of Paris, I'm leading a digital initiative, and we hope to convince all the veterans teachers to move in. I'm actually trying to identify in each school a group, 2 or 3 leaders who could convince their colleagues that it's a good idea to change. Yes, it is part of a general. It's part of a slow transformation, but teachers always have had. This is really not new. Teachers always have had in France the possibility to get lifelong education if they want to.
Marianne.
I love the fact that you are systematically addressing cultural partnerships, especially for socially disadvantaged children. And I'm wondering if you're able to do that throughout the country, or is that only able to happen in places like Paris?
Each rector, it's part of our margin of initiative. But we are all encouraged to do it. The Minister of Education and the Minister of Culture have signed an agreement about education to the arts, for instance, in this social view that, or socially minded view that culture matters, and that culture can be a great tool for ensuring educational success. I'm personally absolutely convinced from discussing with those students I see in these neighborhoods, that their view of the world, and I mentioned culture, I should add also that we use also international partnerships. We put money there so that these kids can travel, can go to Chicago, can go to Beijing, can go to London, can go to Berlin. These are the cities with which we have partnership at the academy level. I'm convinced that culture is a major tool. In Paris, we have no excuse for not using it in order to broaden their horizon. They have a view of their world which is usually limited to 2 streets or 3 streets around the school and around their apartment. We are trying to show them that the world is a little larger. And for that, culture is a wonderful tool. In Paris, we have wonderful partners with whom we can work, but it's really true in each academy. There are different strategies. Again, in a rural academy, the type of cultural institution that will be there will be different. But all rectors are working and can work on these issues, yes.
Tom.
So you referenced earlier the riots, and I think one of the challenges of the French system that is apparent even from this far away is that your increasingly pluralist society driven through immigration has created some cultural fractures and also some fractures in terms of level of preparation. How are you addressing those problems more explicitly?
Actually, there is a smaller proportion of migrants in France today than there was, for instance, in the 1920s or the 1930s. But the context has changed. The social contract has changed, and as I mentioned, the relationship to authority has changed, and this is what impacts the school. Therefore, yes, we have a significant part of the population which is recently arrived and which we are trying to bring into the school culture, a school culture that's increasingly pluralist. Again, in the early 20th century, the model was not pluralist, and the relationship to authority was, in a sense, simpler. We have to deal with a more complex picture, and this is one of the challenges I described.
Okay, in the back of the room. I can't see you. Bernie.
What's the role of private commercial interest in the French system, both with respect to operations and policy?
Did you hear the question?
Yes, I heard the question, but can you be a little more specific?
The educational industry,
Okay.
corporate France.
All right.
You mentioned the state. I'm interested in the state's relationship to other institutions.
It's historically the relationship is not that significant, especially with corporation, but it's changing. I've signed partnership with several very large corporations in France, especially for our vocational schools, many corporations in France recognize that the better the children are educated, the better type of labor they will be able to employ in a few years. So now that have realized that, they have become more easily partners of the public educational system. There is also a large private industry that's developed around the system, be it for textbooks, publishing house, etc., which are also partners of the schools, and clearly is impacted by the digital revolution. Finally, there is a private sector, educational sector in France these days. It's not very significant in terms of numbers, and again, I'm distinguishing between this private sector and, for instance, Catholic schools, which are an important part of the system, which usually have a contract with the state and exist, especially in Western France and in Paris. There is a private sector of, let's say, diverse value and quality, which has developed both in primary, secondary, and higher education. It's difficult for me to give a general assessment of it because its quality is really diverse.
So Pat, and I think we're going to have to make that the last question.
Thank you. Can you speak a little bit to the role of leaders and leadership development as part of your plan going forward?
Right. Something that I've discovered arriving from higher education. I was the president of School for Advanced Studies in Social Sciences, which is the leading French school in social sciences, and a great partner of New York University, by the way. What I've discovered when I took on this job a year, 15 months ago, was the importance of leaders, especially high school principals, who and school directors, elementary school directors, who are actually key to making this transformation, this reform, a success or not. So we've been working with my deputy rector, the director of the Academy of Paris. We have been working as much as possible to convince the high school principals that that there are advantages to these reform. I see their representative once a month. They see the director, my deputy, almost every week. So I go and I visit many schools in Paris. It's part of my week to be every week in a school or a high school in Paris and to have direct discussion both with the school principal and the leaders, but also with the teachers, which is a good way to have the vision of the colleagues who are in the field in a very direct way, and I can assure you that they speak directly to the rector, which is good.
So please join me in thanking Dr. Weil for a wonderful presentation, and for someone who is relatively new to primary and secondary education, I must say he demonstrates that he has mastered a very steep learning curve. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We have coffee, a coffee break served in the alcove at the back of the room.